Marcus Chun had always believed that discipline was the foundation of everything worthwhile in life. At 28 years old, he stood 6 feet tall, with the lean, powerful build of someone who had dedicated nearly 2 decades to martial arts. His black belt in karate wasn't just a piece of cloth around his waist. It was a symbol of countless hours of training, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to the principles his sensei had taught him since he was 10 years old. The early morning mist clung to the palace grounds as Marcus adjusted his crisp white uniform. Today marked his 3rd month as a member of the Royal Guard, a position he had worked tirelessly to achieve. The selection process had been grueling, requiring not only physical excellence, but also psychological evaluation, background checks, and a demonstration of the kind of character befitting someone trusted with the safety of the royal family. Marcus remembered the day he had first walked through these ornate gates. The palace was a magnificent structure that seemed to rise from the earth like something from a fairy tale. Ancient stone walls were adorned with intricate carvings that told the history of the kingdom, while perfectly manicured gardens stretched as far as the eye could see. The responsibility of protecting this place and the people within it had filled him with a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. His journey to this moment had begun in a small dojo on the outskirts of the city. Master Takashi, an elderly Japanese man with weathered hands and kind eyes, had seen something in the quiet boy who had wandered into his studio one rainy afternoon. Marcus's parents had been going through a difficult divorce, and the 10-year-old had been looking for somewhere to belong, somewhere to find stability in a world that suddenly felt uncertain. Karate is not about fighting, Master Takashi had told him on that first day. It is about understanding yourself, controlling your emotions, and using your strength to protect those who cannot protect themselves. These words have become Marcus's guiding philosophy, shaping not only his approach to martial arts but his entire worldview. Through his teenage years, while other boys were playing video games or chasing girls, Marcus was in the dojo. He arrived early and stayed late, perfecting his kata, strengthening his body, and, most importantly, learning to master his mind. Master Takashi taught him that true power came not from the ability to harm others, but from the discipline to choose restraint even when provoked. The path to his black belt had been marked by countless challenges. There was the tournament when he was 16, where he faced an opponent twice his size who had been trash-talking him for weeks. Every instinct screamed at him to respond with aggression, but Master Takashi's teachings held firm. Marcus won that match through superior technique and mental discipline, never once letting anger cloud his judgment. There was the night when he was walking home from the dojo and witnessed 3 men attacking an elderly shopkeeper. Marcus had intervened, but he had used only the minimum force necessary to subdue the attackers and protect the victim. The police had commended his restraint, noting how easily the situation could have escalated into something much worse if someone less disciplined had gotten involved. These experiences had reinforced Marcus's belief in the code he lived by. Strength without wisdom was dangerous, and martial arts without moral grounding was merely violence dressed up in tradition. He carried this philosophy with him when he applied to join the Royal Guard, believing that his background made him uniquely qualified to serve in such a prestigious position. The Royal Guard was an elite unit composed of men and women selected from various backgrounds, former military personnel, police officers, and civilians like Marcus who had demonstrated exceptional character and ability. Each member underwent extensive training in protection protocols, crisis management, and the delicate art of maintaining security while preserving the dignity and accessibility that the royal family valued. Captain Elizabeth Morrison had been Marcus's commanding officer since his arrival. A 20-year veteran with steel-gray hair and sharp blue eyes, she commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation. She had seen something in Marcus during his evaluation period that reminded her of herself when she was younger, a quiet intensity and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right, regardless of personal cost. "You have excellent instincts, Chun," she had told him after his first month. "Your martial arts background shows in how you carry yourself, how you assess situations. But remember, our job here is different from what you're used to. We're not just bodyguards. We're guardians of an institution that represents something larger than any one person." Marcus had taken those words to heart, throwing himself into his duties with the same dedication he had brought to his martial arts training. He studied the palace layout until he could navigate it blindfolded. He memorized the schedules and habits of every member of the royal family and their staff. He practiced emergency protocols until they became second nature. But it was the people within the palace walls who truly captured his attention. King Frederick was a thoughtful man in his early 60s who had inherited the throne during one of the most challenging periods in the kingdom's modern history. Rather than retreating into the isolation that often accompanied royal life, he had made it his mission to remain connected to his people, regularly hosting public events and maintaining an open-door policy that made his security team nervous but endeared him to the nation. Queen Isabella was equally remarkable, though in different ways. A former humanitarian worker who had met the king during a disaster relief operation, she brought a compassion and real-world perspective to the royal family that resonated with people from all walks of life. Their children, Prince Alexander and Princess Sophia, were teenagers who somehow managed to remain grounded despite growing up in extraordinary circumstances. It was his family that Marcus had sworn to protect, and he took that oath seriously. Every morning, he would arrive at the palace before dawn, spending an hour in quiet meditation before beginning his shift. This practice, something Master Takashi had taught him years ago, helped him center himself and prepare mentally for whatever the day might bring. The other guards had initially been somewhat skeptical of Marcus. His background was different from most of theirs, and his quiet, contemplative nature stood in contrast to the more boisterous camaraderie that typically characterized military and law enforcement units. But over time, they had come to respect his competence and reliability. There was James Murphy, a former Army sergeant with a thick Irish accent and an endless supply of stories from his tours overseas. Despite his gruff exterior, he had a protective instinct that made him excellent at his job. Then there was Sarah Kim, a former police detective whose sharp analytical mind could spot potential problems before they developed. And Rodriguez, whose background in special forces had given him skills that proved invaluable in their line of work. These relationships had become important to Marcus in ways he hadn't expected. The Royal Guard wasn't just a job. It was a brotherhood and sisterhood of people who had committed themselves to something larger than their individual ambitions. They trained together, worked together, and looked out for one another with a loyalty that reminded Marcus of the bonds he had formed in the dojo. The palace itself was a world unto itself, with its own rhythms and customs that took time to understand. There were the formal state occasions that required meticulous planning and coordination, where every movement was choreographed and every contingency anticipated. But there were also quieter moments, watching the Queen tend to her garden, or seeing the King work late into the night on legislation he believed would benefit his people. Marcus found himself particularly drawn to these quieter moments. They reminded him why he had chosen this path, why he had dedicated his life to service and protection. It wasn't about the prestige or the uniform. It was about being part of something meaningful, something that mattered. On this particular morning, as Marcus stood at his post near the palace's main entrance, he reflected on how far he had come. The scared 10-year-old who had wandered into Master Takashi's dojo was gone, replaced by a man who had found his purpose in life. His martial arts training had given him the tools he needed, but it was his experiences since then, the challenges he had faced, the relationships he had built, the responsibilities he had shouldered, that had shaped him into the person he was today. The sun was beginning to rise over the palace grounds, painting the ancient stones in shades of gold and amber. In a few hours, the day's official activities would begin, bringing with them the usual mixture of ceremony, responsibility, and the constant vigilance that defined life in the Royal Guard. Marcus adjusted his stance slightly, his trained eye automatically scanning the grounds for anything unusual. Everything appeared normal. The gardeners were beginning their daily work. Early morning joggers were following their usual route along the public path that skirted the palace grounds, and his fellow guards were at their assigned positions, alert and professional. This was his life now, and he was exactly where he wanted to be. He had found a way to use his skills and training in service of something greater than himself. The principles Master Takashi had taught him, discipline, restraint, protection of the innocent, had guided him to this place, and he was confident they would continue to guide him through whatever challenges lay ahead. As he stood there in the growing light of dawn, Marcus had no way of knowing that before the day was over, everything he believed about himself, his training, and his purpose would be put to the ultimate test. The code he had lived by for nearly 2 decades was about to face a challenge unlike anything he had ever encountered, and the outcome would change not only his life, but the lives of everyone around him. The palace grounds were peaceful in the early morning light, but beneath that tranquility, forces were already in motion that would soon shatter the calm and force Marcus to confront the most difficult question any warrior can face. When the principles you have lived by collide with the realities of the moment, which do you choose to follow? The morning briefing took place in the security office at exactly 7 o'clock, as it had every day for the past 3 months. Captain Morrison stood at the front of the room, her pressed uniform and confident bearing commanding immediate attention from the assembled guards. The office itself was a study in efficiency. Banks of monitors displayed feeds from security cameras throughout the palace. Communication equipment hummed quietly in the background, and detailed schedules and protocols covered one entire wall. "Good morning, everyone," Morrison began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned her position through years of exemplary service. Today's schedule includes the usual morning briefing with His Majesty at 8:30, followed by the quarterly meeting with the Minister of Defense at 10. This afternoon, we have a reception for the visiting delegation from the neighboring kingdom of Aldoria. Marcus listened carefully, taking mental notes as Morrison outlined the day's security requirements. The Valdorian delegation was particularly significant. The two kingdoms have been working toward a trade agreement that could benefit both nations considerably, and this reception represented months of careful diplomatic negotiation. The Valdorian security team will be conducting a final sweep of the reception hall this morning. Morrison continued. "Chun, I want you to coordinate with them. Your attention to detail and ability to work with people from different backgrounds makes you the right choice for this assignment." Marcus nodded, feeling a familiar surge of pride at being trusted with such responsibility. Working with foreign security teams required not just technical competence, but also diplomatic skills, the ability to maintain security standards while respecting the protocols and sensitivities of visiting dignitaries. Murphy, Kim, you'll be handling the perimeter during the reception. Rodriguez, you'll be on close protection for their majesties during the delegation meetings. Any questions? The briefing concluded without incident, and Marcus made his way to the reception hall to await the arrival of the Valdorian security team. The hall was one of the palace's most impressive spaces, a vast room with soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens. Oil paintings of former monarchs lined the walls, their faces seeming to watch over the events that unfolded in their presence. As Marcus surveyed the room, he found himself thinking about the importance of what would take place here later. Diplomacy was often invisible work. Endless meetings, careful negotiations, and delicate balancing of competing interests. But when it worked, it could prevent conflicts that might otherwise cost countless lives. His role in protecting these proceedings might seem small, but he understood that every person involved, from the monarchs themselves to the guards ensuring their safety, played a vital part in something larger. The Valdorian security team arrived precisely at 8:15, their punctuality speaking to their professionalism. The team leader introduced himself as Captain Viktor Kozlov, a man in his early 40s with the bearing of someone who had seen considerable action. His English was excellent, though colored with the distinctive accent of his homeland. "Captain Morrison speaks very highly of you," Guardsman Chun, Kozlov said as they began their walk through the reception hall. "She tells me you have excellent instincts and good attention to detail." "Thank you, Captain. I try to be thorough in my work," Marcus replied, immediately appreciating the straightforward manner of his counterpart. "What specific concerns does your team have about this afternoon's event?" For the next hour, they worked through the security protocols systematically. Kozlov's team was clearly experienced and professional, and Marcus found their methodical approach reassuring. They identified sight lines, discussed positioning, and coordinated communication procedures. Everything proceeded smoothly, and by the end of the session, both teams had a clear understanding of their respective roles and responsibilities. It was during this coordination meeting that Marcus first encountered Lieutenant Alexander Petrov, Kozlov's second-in-command. Petrov was younger than his captain, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of intense stare that suggested he took himself very seriously. Unlike Kozlov, whose professionalism was tempered by courtesy, Petrov seemed to view the coordination process as an inconvenience rather than a necessity. "Your security measures seem adequate," Petrov said when introduced to Marcus, the word adequate carrying a subtle implication that they could be better. In Valdoria, we take a more comprehensive approach to protection. Marcus felt a flicker of irritation at the implied criticism, but reminded himself that cultural differences in approach were common in international security work. Some teams favored highly visible displays of force, while others, like the Palace Guard, preferred a more subtle presence that maintained security without creating an atmosphere of tension. We find that our approach works well for the specific environment and cultural expectations here, Marcus replied diplomatically. But I'd be interested to hear about your methods. Different perspectives often lead to improved procedures. Petrov's expression suggested he interpreted this response as weakness rather than professional courtesy. But Captain Kozlov intervened before the exchange could develop into something more problematic. Lieutenant Petrov brings valuable experience from his service in our special forces, Kozlov explained. Sometimes his enthusiasm for comprehensive security makes him forget that different situations require different approaches. The remainder of the morning passed without incident, and Marcus felt satisfied that the afternoon's reception would proceed smoothly. The coordination between the two security teams was working well, and all the necessary preparations had been completed. As he made his way to the staff cafeteria for lunch, he reflected on how much he had learned in just 3 months about the complexities of international diplomatic security. The cafeteria was a more relaxed environment where guards could decompress between shifts. Marcus had grown to appreciate these breaks, not just for the physical rest, but for the camaraderie they provided. Today, Murphy and Kim were discussing their morning patrol, while Rodriguez was reviewing notes from a training session he had attended the previous week. "How did the coordination go with our Valdorian friends?" Kim asked as Marcus joined them at their usual table. "Pretty well overall," Marcus replied, taking a bite of his sandwich. "Their team leader seems very professional. There's one lieutenant who's a bit intense, but nothing we can't work with." "Intense how?" Murphy asked, his years of military experience making him sensitive to personality conflicts that could affect operational effectiveness. Marcus considered his response carefully. He didn't want to create problems where none existed, but he also understood the importance of keeping his colleagues informed about potential issues. "Just very focused on demonstrating their capabilities," he said finally. "Some people feel they need to prove themselves in international settings. It's not uncommon." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Marcus found himself thinking about his brief interaction with Lieutenant Petrov. There had been something in the man's manner that suggested more than professional pride, an underlying tension that made Marcus slightly uneasy. He made a mental note to keep an eye on the lieutenant during the afternoon's proceedings. After lunch, Marcus returned to his quarters to change into his dress uniform for the reception. The dress uniform was more formal than their daily working attire, navy blue with gold braiding and the royal insignia prominently displayed. It was a uniform that carried weight and tradition, representing not just individual service, but connection to generations of guards who had served the monarchy. As he adjusted his tie and checked his appearance in the mirror, Marcus thought about the path that had brought him to this moment. The scared boy in Master Takashi's dojo would hardly recognize the man looking back from the reflection. The years of training, the gradual building of confidence and skill, the lessons learned through both success and failure, all of it had led to this room, this uniform, this responsibility. He arrived back at the reception hall 30 minutes before the event was scheduled to begin. The space had been transformed since morning. Flowers arranged with artistic precision, refreshment tables positioned for optimal flow, and lighting adjusted to create an atmosphere that was both elegant and welcoming. The palace staff had worked their usual magic, creating an environment worthy of the important diplomatic occasion. The Valdorian security team was already in position, their dress uniforms similar to the palace guards, but with the distinctive insignia of their homeland. Marcus noted with approval that they had followed the positioning protocols exactly as discussed during the morning coordination meeting. Captain Morrison made a final check of all positions, ensuring that every member of both security teams understood their role and responsibilities. The reception was scheduled to begin at 3 o'clock, with the royal family making their entrance 15 minutes later. Everything was proceeding according to plan. As the first guests began to arrive, Marcus took his assigned position near the main entrance. From here, he could observe the entire room while maintaining the subtle presence that characterized the palace guard's approach. The early arrivals were mostly diplomatic staff and government officials, people whose faces he recognized from security briefings and previous events. The Valdorian delegation arrived as a group, their formal attire and dignified bearing appropriate to the occasion. Marcus watched as they moved through the receiving line, exchanging pleasantries with the various officials present. Everything appeared normal and professional. It was at precisely 3:15, just as the royal family was making their entrance, that Marcus noticed Lieutenant Petrov moving away from his assigned position. The movement was subtle, not dramatic enough to draw general attention, but significant enough to catch the eye of someone trained to notice deviations from established protocols. Marcus frowned slightly, wondering if Petrov had spotted some potential security concern that required investigation. But as he watched more carefully, he began to realize that the lieutenant's movement didn't match any of the standard patterns for responding to security issues. Instead, Petrov seemed to be positioning himself for some purpose that Marcus couldn't immediately understand. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Petrov wasn't responding to a security threat. He was creating one. The careful positioning, the timing with the royal family's entrance, the way he was moving to avoid the sight lines of his own team members. Everything pointed to a plan that had nothing to do with protection and everything to do with attack. For a moment that seemed to last forever, Marcus stood frozen by the magnitude of what he was seeing. This wasn't the kind of external threat they had trained for. Random attackers or organized terrorist groups trying to force their way into the palace. This was someone on the inside, someone with legitimate access and detailed knowledge of security protocols, someone who had been trusted with the same responsibility that Marcus held sacred. His martial arts training kicked in automatically, the way Master Takashi had taught him to respond when analysis paralysis threatened to prevent action. The mind could become confused by complex situations, but the body trained through years of practice would respond correctly if trusted to do so. Marcus began moving toward Petrov's position, his path calculated to intercept whatever action the lieutenant was planning without creating a disturbance that would alert other potential threats or panic the gathered dignitaries. Every step was measured, every movement designed to appear routine to casual observers, while positioning him to respond to whatever was about to unfold. As he closed the distance, Marcus could see Petrov's hand moving toward his jacket, a movement that could be innocent but, given the circumstances, almost certainly was not. The lieutenant's attention was focused entirely on the royal family, his body language indicating someone preparing to act rather than someone maintaining protective watch. Time seemed to slow as Marcus realized that within seconds, he would be forced to make a decision that would define not only the rest of his life, but potentially the fate of everyone in the room. Everything he had trained for, everything he believed about duty and protection was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible. The distance between them was closing rapidly, and Marcus could feel his heart rate increasing despite years of training designed to maintain calm under pressure. In a few more steps, he would be close enough to act. The question was no longer whether he would need to intervene, but how that intervention would unfold and what its consequences would be. As he prepared to close the final few feet between himself and Lieutenant Petrov, Marcus found himself thinking about Master Takashi's teachings about the nature of true strength. The warrior's greatest challenge, his sensei had once told him, is not defeating enemies, but maintaining honor while doing what must be done. In a matter of seconds, Marcus would discover whether 18 years of training had prepared him for the most important test of his life. The world seemed to move in slow motion as Marcus closed the final distance between himself and Lieutenant Petrov. His 18 years of martial arts training had taught him to recognize the subtle signs of someone preparing for violence. The slight shift in weight distribution, the unconscious tensing of muscles, the way breathing patterns changed when adrenaline flooded the system. Every indicator he had learned to read was screaming that Petrov was seconds away from acting on whatever plan he had conceived. Marcus's approach was textbook perfect, angled to minimize the chance of being noticed while maximizing his ability to intervene effectively. His footsteps were silent on the polished marble floor, his movement fluid enough to appear casual to anyone who might glance his way. Years of training had made these skills second nature, allowing him to think tactically while his body responded with practiced precision. But as he drew within arm's reach of the Valdorian lieutenant, something unexpected happened. Petrov sensed his approach, perhaps catching a reflection in one of the room's many mirrors, or simply developing the kind of peripheral awareness that came with military training. The lieutenant's head turned slightly, his eyes meeting Marcus's for a split second that contained enough communication to change everything. In that instant, Marcus saw something he had not anticipated. Petrov's eyes held not the focused determination of someone about to commit an act of violence, but the wide-eyed panic of someone who had just realized he was about to be caught in the act of something he shouldn't be doing. It was the look of someone who had made a terrible mistake and was about to face the consequences. "Wait," Petrov said quietly, his voice barely audible over the gentle murmur of diplomatic conversation filling the reception hall. "You don't understand," but Marcus was already in motion. His training had taught him that hesitation in the face of a potential threat to those he was sworn to protect could have catastrophic consequences. The safety of the royal family and everyone in the room depended on neutralizing the threat immediately before whatever Petrov was planning could be carried out. The strike was clean and precise, a palm-heel strike to Petrov's solar plexus designed to incapacitate without causing permanent damage. Marcus had practiced this technique thousands of times, both in training and in real-world situations. It was a perfect application of the controlled force that Master Takashi had spent years teaching him to master. The impact was exactly what Marcus had intended. Petrov doubled over, the breath knocked out of him, his hand falling away from whatever he had been reaching for in his jacket. For a moment, Marcus felt the familiar satisfaction of technique executed flawlessly under pressure. He had identified a threat, assessed the situation correctly, and responded with exactly the right amount of force to neutralize the danger without causing unnecessary harm. But that moment of satisfaction lasted only until he saw what fell from Petrov's jacket pocket as the man stumbled backward from the blow. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't anything threatening at all. Instead, a small, wrapped package hit the floor with a soft thud, followed by what appeared to be a handwritten note. As the items scattered on the marble, Marcus felt a cold dread beginning to form in the pit of his stomach. Something was very wrong with his assessment of the situation. Petrov, still gasping for breath, looked up at Marcus with an expression of pain and confusion that had nothing to do with the physical discomfort of the strike he had just received. "I was trying to deliver a message," he managed to say between labored breaths. "Personal, not official." The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place with horrible clarity. Marcus picked up the note that had fallen from Petrov's jacket, his hands beginning to shake as he read the few lines written in what appeared to be a woman's handwriting. "My dearest Alexander, I know the risks of what we're doing, but I couldn't let this opportunity pass without trying to see you again. I'll be in the palace gardens after the reception. Please, if there's any way. Love always, Elena." The package, Marcus realized with growing horror, was probably a small gift, the kind of personal token that lovers exchange when separated by circumstances beyond their control. Lieutenant Petrov hadn't been preparing to attack anyone. He had been trying to deliver a clandestine love letter to someone inside the palace. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. Elena, he knew that name. Princess Sophia's lady-in-waiting was named Elena Marchetti, a young woman from a noble Valdorian family who served at court. The princess had mentioned her several times in conversations Marcus had overheard. If Petrov and Elena had developed a romantic relationship during previous diplomatic exchanges, the lieutenant's nervous behavior and secretive movements suddenly made perfect sense. Romance between members of different royal courts was not uncommon, but it was politically sensitive and had to be handled with extreme discretion. Petrov had been trying to arrange a clandestine meeting with his beloved, not plot an attack on the royal family. His movement away from his assigned position, his nervous demeanor, his focus on timing, all of it had been motivated by love, not violence. And Marcus had just assaulted an innocent man based on a catastrophically incorrect assessment of the situation. The sound of Petrov hitting the floor had been soft, but in the acoustically perfect reception hall, it was enough to draw attention from nearby guests. Several people turned toward the commotion, including Captain Kozlov, who began moving in their direction with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he recognized trouble when he saw it. Marcus found himself facing a situation for which no amount of training had prepared him. Every instinct screamed at him to help Petrov to his feet, to apologize, to try to explain the misunderstanding. But He was in full view of dozens of diplomatic guests, including his own commanding officers and the royal family he was sworn to protect. Any action he took now would be scrutinized, analyzed, and potentially used to judge not just his individual competence, but the effectiveness of the entire palace security apparatus. What happened here? Captain Kozlov asked as he approached, his voice carrying the kind of controlled tension that comes when a professional recognizes that a situation has gone badly wrong. Marcus's mouth felt dry as he struggled to find words that could possibly explain what he had done. "I believe Lieutenant Petrov was reaching for a weapon," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I acted to neutralize what I perceived as a threat to the royal family." Kozlov's eyes moved from Marcus to his own lieutenant, who was slowly getting back to his feet with one hand pressed against his chest where Marcus's strike had landed. The Valdorian captain's expression was carefully neutral, but Marcus could see the anger building behind his professional composure. "And what weapon did you observe my lieutenant attempting to draw?" Kozlov asked, his tone making it clear that he could see no evidence of any such weapon. Before Marcus could respond, Petrov managed to speak. "Captain, I made an error in positioning. I moved from my assigned post to..." He trailed off, clearly unwilling to explain the real reason for his movement in front of the assembled crowd. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus realized that Petrov was trying to protect him by not explaining the true nature of his actions, an act of kindness that only made Marcus feel worse about what he had done. The lieutenant was willing to take blame for creating a security incident rather than reveal his romantic involvement with a member of the court. Captain Morrison appeared at Marcus's shoulder, her arrival so quiet he hadn't noticed her approach. Her face was a mask of professional calm, but Marcus had worked with her long enough to recognize the signs of controlled fury. She had witnessed enough of the incident to understand that something had gone seriously wrong. "Gentlemen, perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private," she suggested, though her tone made it clear that this was not really a suggestion at all. As they moved toward a small antechamber adjacent to the reception hall, Marcus caught sight of several guests watching the proceedings with the kind of intense interest that diplomatic incidents always generated. He realized with growing dread that word of this confrontation would spread throughout the diplomatic community within hours, potentially affecting the very trade negotiations the reception was intended to support. The antechamber was mercifully private, furnished with comfortable chairs and a small table that suggested it was typically used for informal meetings and quiet conversations. Once the door closed behind them, the weight of what had occurred seemed to settle over the group like a physical presence. "I want a full explanation of what just happened," Morrison said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with crises throughout her career but had never expected to face something like this from one of her own people. Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the future of diplomatic relations between the two kingdoms. "I observed Lieutenant Petrov moving away from his assigned position in a manner that I interpreted as suspicious. When I saw him reaching into his jacket while focused on the royal family, I believed he was preparing to draw a weapon. I acted to neutralize what I perceived as an immediate threat." "And you based this assessment on what, specifically?" Kozlov asked, his English becoming more heavily accented as his anger grew. "My lieutenant's movement? His positioning? Or perhaps you simply assumed that because he is foreign, he must be dangerous?" The accusation hit Marcus like a slap. The suggestion that his actions had been motivated by prejudice rather than professional judgment was both insulting and deeply troubling. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that his assessment had been based on tactical considerations rather than bias, but the evidence seemed to argue against him. "I don't believe nationality played any role in Guardsman Chen's assessment," Morrison said firmly, stepping in to defend her subordinate, even while clearly struggling with the situation herself. "However, I'm deeply concerned about the judgment that led to this incident." Petrov, who had been quiet during this exchange, finally spoke. "Captain Morrison, if I may, I accept responsibility for creating confusion through my movement away from assigned position. Perhaps in my eagerness to ensure comprehensive coverage of the reception area, I acted in a way that could be misinterpreted." His willingness to accept blame for something that was clearly not his fault made Marcus feel even worse. The lieutenant was demonstrating exactly the kind of honor and integrity that Marcus had always believed he possessed, while Marcus himself had acted in a way that violated every principle his training was supposed to have instilled in him. "That's very generous of you, Lieutenant," Morrison replied, "but it doesn't address the fundamental problem here. One of my guards physically assaulted a member of an Allied security team based on a threat assessment that proved to be completely incorrect." The words hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be disputed. Marcus had indeed done exactly what Morrison described, and no amount of explanation could change that fundamental fact. His martial arts training had given him the physical skills to act decisively, but it had failed to provide him with the wisdom to recognize when action was inappropriate. As they stood in the quiet antechamber, the sounds of the reception continuing in the adjacent hall, serving as a reminder of the diplomatic importance of what was taking place, Marcus began to understand that the consequences of the next few minutes would extend far beyond his individual career. The trust between Allied security teams, the reputation of the Palace Guard, and potentially the broader relationship between the two kingdoms, all of it hung in the balance because of his mistake. He thought of Master Takashi and what his sensei would say about this moment. The old man had always taught that true martial arts was about preventing conflict rather than winning it, about using strength to protect rather than to harm. In this crucial test of those principles, Marcus had failed completely. The irony was devastating. He had spent 18 years training his body and mind to be a protector, but when the moment came to demonstrate those skills, his actions had created exactly the kind of incident his training was meant to prevent. The black belt around his waist, symbol of everything he had worked for, suddenly felt like a weight around his neck. "We need to discuss how to proceed," Morrison said quietly. "This situation requires careful handling to prevent it from becoming a larger diplomatic incident." But Marcus was beginning to realize that no amount of careful handling could undo what had already been done. The moment his palm had connected with Lieutenant Petrov's chest, he had set in motion a chain of events that would force everyone involved to confront difficult questions about trust, judgment, and the true nature of protection. In the silence that followed, he could almost hear Master Takashi's voice asking the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. When strength is used without wisdom, what is accomplished except harm? The immediate aftermath of the incident unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of damage control. Captain Morrison and Captain Kozlov, both seasoned professionals who understood the delicate nature of international relations, worked together to ensure that the reception could continue without further disruption. Lieutenant Petrov, despite his obvious discomfort, returned to his duties with a professionalism that made Marcus's shame burn even deeper. But while the public face of the diplomatic event remained smooth and polished, Marcus could feel the undercurrents of tension that his actions had created. He saw it in the careful way his fellow guards watched him for the remainder of the reception, in the pointed conversations between various officials, and, most painfully, in the disappointed glances from Captain Morrison whenever their paths crossed. The reception concluded without further incident, but Marcus knew that the real consequences were only beginning to unfold. As the last guest departed, and the palace staff began the process of returning the reception hall to its normal state, he found himself summoned to Morrison's office for what he knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of his career. The security office felt different now, smaller somehow, and charged with a tension that hadn't existed during the morning briefing. Morrison sat behind her desk, her expression unreadable as she reviewed what appeared to be an incident report that had already grown to several pages. The efficiency with which the paperwork had been generated spoke to the seriousness with which the palace administration was treating what had occurred. "Sit down, Marcus," Morrison said, using his first name in a way that somehow made the situation feel both more personal and more grave. "We need to talk about what happened today, and, more importantly, about what happens next." Marcus took the chair across from her desk, his training automatically adjusting his posture to appear alert and professional despite the turmoil he felt inside. "Captain, I want to apologize for—" "Stop," Morrison interrupted, holding up one hand. "Before you say anything else, you need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with here. This isn't just about one mistake in judgment. What happened today has implications that extend far beyond this palace." She pulled out a folder and opened it on her desk, revealing what appeared to be communications from various government departments. "In the past 3 hours, I've received calls from the Foreign Ministry, the Defense Department, and the Prime Minister's office. The Valdorian delegation has filed a formal complaint about the conduct of palace security, and there are already rumors circulating in diplomatic circles about the incident. The weight of her words settled over Marcus like a physical burden. He had known that his actions would have consequences, but the speed and scope of the diplomatic fallout was more extensive than he had imagined possible. A simple mistake in judgment was threatening to become an international incident. The Valdorians are being remarkably gracious about the whole thing, Morrison continued. Captain Kozlov has made it clear that they understand security personnel sometimes face difficult split-second decisions. But that graciousness only goes so far, and it doesn't address the fundamental problem we're facing. She leaned back in her chair, her expression softening slightly. Marcus, I've known you for 3 months. In that time, you've shown yourself to be dedicated, conscientious, and reliable. Your martial arts background has been an asset in every aspect of your work here. That's what makes today so difficult to understand. I misread the situation, Marcus said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw a movement that seemed suspicious, and I acted on instinct without taking the time to properly assess what was actually happening. But that's just it, Morrison replied. Your instincts have been excellent up to this point. You've demonstrated repeatedly that you can assess situations accurately and respond appropriately. So what was different about today? It was a question Marcus had been asking himself since the moment he realized his mistake, and he still didn't have a satisfactory answer. He thought back to the morning coordination meeting, to his observations of Lieutenant Petrov, to the series of small details that had led him to conclude that the Valdorian officer represented a threat. I think I let my guard training override my martial arts training, he said finally. Master Takashi always taught me to observe carefully before acting, to make sure I understood the full situation before committing to any course of action. But my training here has emphasized the importance of immediate response to potential threats. When I saw what I interpreted as suspicious behavior, I acted on the principle that it's better to be wrong about a threat than to be slow responding to a real one. Morrison nodded slowly. That's a fair assessment, and it highlights one of the fundamental tensions in our work. We have to balance vigilance with restraint, preparation with patience. It's not an easy balance to maintain, and even experienced professionals sometimes get it wrong. The sympathy in her voice made Marcus feel worse rather than better. He would have preferred anger or disappointment, emotions he could understand and accept as appropriate consequences for his actions. Instead, Morrison's understanding response forced him to confront the complexity of what he had done and its broader implications. What happens now, he asked. Morrison closed the folder and leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. Several things need to happen, and they need to happen quickly. First, you'll be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation of the incident. That investigation will include interviews with everyone present, a review of security footage, and a comprehensive analysis of the protocols that were followed. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Administrative leave meant the end of his routine, his purpose, his connection to the work that had given his life meaning. More than that, it meant the acknowledgement that his fitness for duty was now in question. Second, Morrison continued, you'll need to participate in a formal review process that will examine not just today's incident, but your overall performance and suitability for continued service in the Royal Guard. That review will involve senior officers, psychological evaluation, and possibly testimony from the Valdorian security team. And third, Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Third, regardless of the outcome of the investigation, there will be consequences for your career. Even if the review concludes that your actions were understandable given the circumstances, the fact remains that you physically assaulted a member of an allied security team based on an incorrect threat assessment. That's not something that can be simply overlooked. The finality in her voice made it clear that Marcus's time as a member of the Royal Guard was effectively over. The investigation might determine the specific nature of the disciplinary action he would face, but his career in palace security was finished. The realization brought with it a grief that surprised him with its intensity. I understand, he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. When does the administrative leave begin? Immediately. You'll turn in your badge and credentials to Sergeant Collins on your way out. Someone from Human Resources will contact you within 48 hours about the investigation process and what you can expect going forward. Marcus stood up slowly, feeling as though he was moving through water. The familiar weight of his badge and identification card in his pocket would soon be gone, taking with it not just his job but his identity as someone who protected others. The black belt he wore beneath his uniform, invisible to others but always present in his own consciousness, suddenly felt like a cruel joke. "Captain," he said, turning back as he reached the door, "I want you to know that I never intended for any of this to happen. Everything I've done in my career has been motivated by a desire to protect people, not to harm them." Morrison's expression softened again. "I know that, Marcus. That's what makes this so tragic. Your intentions were good, your training was extensive, and your dedication was never in question. Sometimes good people make mistakes with serious consequences, and that's what we're dealing with here." As Marcus left the security office for what he knew would be the last time, he found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The scared 10-year-old in Master Takashi's dojo, the dedicated teenager perfecting his techniques, the young man who had believed that martial arts training could prepare him for any challenge life might present. All of these versions of himself seemed like strangers now. The palace corridors that he had walked with purpose and pride just hours earlier now felt alien and unwelcoming. Staff members he had worked with over the past 3 months nodded politely as he passed, but he could see the questions in their eyes. Word of the incident had spread through the palace community with the speed that gossip always travels in closed environments. Sergeant Collins was waiting for him at the main security checkpoint, the paperwork for his credential surrender already prepared. The process was mercifully quick and professional. Badge, identification card, and access credentials handed over, and logged with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that made the transition feel both final and impersonal. "Good luck, Chun," Collins said as he completed the paperwork. "I hope everything works out." The kindness in the sergeant's voice was genuine, but Marcus could hear the underlying assumption that working out would mean finding some other line of work, some other way to define himself and his purpose in life. His time as a protector, as someone who stood between innocent people and potential harm, was over. As he walked through the palace gates for the last time, Marcus felt the full weight of what he had lost settling over him. It wasn't just a job. It was a calling, a way of life that had given meaning to everything he had worked for over the past 18 years. The martial arts training that had once been his greatest strength had become the source of his greatest failure. The irony was devastating. Master Takashi had taught him that true martial arts was about preventing conflict, about using strength in service of peace and protection. But when the ultimate test had come, Marcus had used his training to create exactly the kind of incident that his skills were meant to prevent. The gap between his intentions and his actions felt like an unbridgeable chasm. Walking through the city streets that he had once patrolled as a guardian, Marcus began to understand that his real journey was only beginning. The investigation would determine the legal and professional consequences of his actions, but the personal reckoning, understanding how he had failed so completely to live up to the principles he had devoted his life to following, would take much longer. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement as he made his way home, each step taking him further from the life he had built and closer to an uncertain future. Behind him, the palace rose against the sky like a reproach, a reminder of the trust he had violated and the responsibility he had failed to honor. In his apartment that evening, surrounded by the symbols of his martial arts journey, belts, certificates, photographs from tournaments, and testing ceremonies, Marcus began to confront the most difficult question of his life. What did it mean to be a martial artist when the very training that defined him had led to such complete failure? The answer, he was beginning to realize, would require him to go back to the beginning, to re-examine everything he thought he knew about strength, wisdom, and the true nature of protection. The black belt around his waist had once represented the culmination of his journey, but now it felt like the starting point for a much more difficult path, one that would require him to find a way to rebuild not just his career, but his understanding of who he was meant to be. The investigation took 3 weeks to complete, but for Marcus, each day felt like a month. The formal proceedings were thorough and professional, conducted by a panel that included senior palace security officials, a representative from the Foreign Ministry, and an independent investigator with experience in international security incidents. Throughout the process, Marcus was treated with courtesy and respect, but the underlying reality was never in doubt. His career as a royal guard was over. The final report, when it was released, was both better and worse than Marcus had expected. Better because it acknowledged that his actions, while misguided, had been motivated by genuine concern for the safety of those he was sworn to protect. Worse, because it detailed with clinical precision every aspect of his failure in judgment, creating a permanent record of how completely he had misread the situation. The panel concludes that Guardsman Chin's actions were the result of a well-intentioned but fundamentally flawed threat assessment, the report stated. While his martial arts background and general performance record demonstrate competence and dedication, his response to the incident in question showed a failure to apply appropriate judgment in a complex diplomatic environment. The recommended discipline was a dismissal from the Royal Guard, but without criminal charges or notation that would prevent him from seeking other employment in security-related fields. It was, as Captain Morrison explained when she called to inform him of the decision, the most favorable outcome possible given the circumstances. The Valdorian delegation has been very understanding throughout this process, she told him during their final conversation. Captain Kozlov made it clear to the panel that they harbor no ill will toward you personally, and Lieutenant Petrov actually spoke in your defense during his testimony. That last detail was perhaps the most painful aspect of the entire ordeal. Petrov had not only refrained from pressing charges, but had actively argued that Marcus's actions, while incorrect, had been understandable given the information available at the time. The lieutenant's generosity of spirit made Marcus's shame burn even deeper. But the formal conclusion of the investigation was only the beginning of Marcus's real journey toward understanding what had happened and what it meant for his future. Stripped of his badge and uniform, forced to confront the gap between his self-image as a protector and the reality of his actions, he found himself questioning everything he had believed about himself and his purpose in life. The first person he turned to was Master Takashi. The elderly sensei received the news of Marcus's dismissal with the same calm dignity he brought to everything in his life, listening without judgment as his former student explained the events that had led to his downfall. "You are hurting," Master Takashi observed when Marcus finished his account. "But perhaps you are hurting about the wrong things." They were sitting in a small garden behind the dojo, a peaceful space where the sensei often conducted his most important conversations. The late afternoon light filtered through the leaves of an ancient maple tree, casting shifting patterns of shadow and illumination that seemed to mirror the complexity of Marcus's emotional state. "I don't understand," Marcus replied. "I failed at everything I was trained to do. How can I be hurting about the wrong things?" "You are grieving the loss of your position, your reputation, your sense of yourself as someone who protects others," the old man said gently. "These are natural things to mourn. But are they the most important things?" Master Takashi stood up slowly, his movements showing the careful precision of someone whose body carried the wisdom of decades of martial arts practice. "Tell me about Lieutenant Petrov. What has happened to him as a result of your actions?" Marcus thought about what he had learned through the investigation process. He completed his assignment with the delegation and returned to Valdoria. His reputation wasn't damaged. If anything, the way he handled the incident enhanced his standing with his superiors. "And what about the diplomatic mission? Did your actions prevent the trade negotiations from succeeding?" "No," Marcus admitted. "The agreements were signed as planned. Both kingdoms benefited from the arrangements that were negotiated. And the royal family you were sworn to protect? Were any of them harmed by what occurred?" "No. They weren't even aware of what had happened until after the reception concluded." Master Takashi returned to his seat, his expression thoughtful. "So your great failure resulted in no lasting harm to any of the people involved." Lieutenant Petrov returned home safely. The diplomatic mission succeeded, and the royal family remained secure. What, then, was actually lost? The question forced Marcus to examine his assumptions about what had occurred. He had been so focused on his personal failure, on the gap between his intentions and his actions, that he hadn't considered the broader context of what had actually been accomplished or prevented. "I lost my position," he said slowly. "I damaged the trust between allied security teams. I created a diplomatic incident." "Did you?" Master Takashi asked. "Or did you experience a moment of confusion that was handled professionally by all parties involved? Sometimes what we call failure is simply life teaching us lessons we needed to learn." Over the following weeks, Marcus began to see his experience from a different perspective. He started volunteering at a community center in one of the city's more challenging neighborhoods, working with young people who reminded him of himself at that age. Kids looking for direction, for something to believe in, for a way to channel their energy and potential into something positive. It was during this volunteer work that Marcus met Elena Rodriguez, a social worker whose approach to helping troubled youth was both compassionate and pragmatic. Elena had heard about Marcus's background through mutual acquaintances at the community center, and she was curious about how martial arts training might benefit the young people she worked with. These kids face situations every day where they have to make split-second decisions about how to respond to conflict, she explained during one of their early conversations. They need tools for managing their reactions, for choosing response over reaction. Marcus found himself drawn into Elena's work, initially as a volunteer instructor teaching basic self-defense and martial arts principles, but gradually as something more like a partner in developing programs that address the whole person rather than just physical skills. It's not enough to teach them how to fight, Elena observed after watching Marcus work with a group of particularly challenging teenagers. They need to understand why fighting should be the last resort, not the first one. The irony of this observation was not lost on Marcus. Here he was teaching young people about restraint and judgment when his own failure in these areas had cost him his career. But rather than feeling hypocritical, he found that his experience had given him insights into the challenges of maintaining discipline under pressure that he might not have had otherwise. One evening, about 2 months after his dismissal from the Royal Guard, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Lieutenant Petrov appeared at his apartment door, dressed in civilian clothes and carrying a small package. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Petrov said when Marcus opened the door, his English still colored by his distinctive accent. "I'm in the city for a few days on personal business, and I wanted to speak with you." They sat in Marcus's living room, surrounded by the martial arts memorabilia that had once represented the pinnacle of his achievement, but now served as reminders of a more complex journey. Petrov declined the offer of refreshment, seeming eager to address whatever had brought him there. "I want you to know," the lieutenant began, "that I have been thinking about our encounter at the palace, and I believe you acted exactly as you should have." Marcus stared at him in surprise. "I saw that you based on a completely incorrect assessment of what you were doing. How could that possibly be the right action?" Petrov smiled slightly, expression that transformed his serious features. "Because in that moment, with the information you had available, you believed I represented a threat to people you were sworn to protect. You acted without hesitation to neutralize what you perceived as danger. That is exactly what a good security professional should do." He leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "I have been in security work for many years. I have seen what happens when people hesitate in the face of potential threats. The consequences of action taken in good faith, even when based on incorrect information, are usually much less severe than the consequences of failing to act when action is needed." "But I was wrong about what you were doing," Marcus protested. "Yes, you were wrong about my specific actions," Petrov acknowledged. "But you were right about your responsibilities. You saw what appeared to be a threat to those under your protection, and you responded immediately and appropriately to neutralize that threat. The fact that I was not actually dangerous does not change the correctness of your response to what you observed." The conversation continued for more than an hour, covering not just the incident at the palace, but the broader challenges of security work in complex international environments. Petrov shared stories from his own career, times when he had made mistakes in judgment, moments when split-second decisions had led to unexpected consequences, instances where the gap between intention and outcome had forced him to question his own competence. "The difference between a good security professional and a great one," he said as he prepared to leave, "is not whether they ever make mistakes. It is whether they learn from those mistakes and use that learning to become better at protecting others." Before departing, Petrov handed Marcus the small package he had brought. Inside was a book on tactical decision-making in high-stress environments, inscribed with a note, "To a colleague who understands that protection sometimes requires difficult choices. Your moment of uncertainty has made me a better guard." In the months that followed, Marcus began to develop a new understanding of his experience and its place in his larger journey. The community center work expanded into a formal program that combined martial arts training with conflict resolution education, anger management, and life skills development. Elena became not just a colleague, but a close friend whose perspective on human behavior and social dynamics complemented his understanding of physical discipline and mental preparation. The program they developed together attracted attention from social services agencies, schools, and even law enforcement organizations looking for innovative approaches to youth development and crime prevention. Marcus found himself traveling to conferences, sharing his story and the lessons he had learned from his spectacular failure at the palace. My training taught me to be strong and disciplined, he would tell audiences of social workers, teachers, and youth counselors. But it took failure to teach me the difference between strength and wisdom, between reaction and response. A year after his dismissal from the Royal Guard, Marcus received a letter from Captain Morrison. She had been following his work at the community center through mutual acquaintances, and she wanted him to know that the Palace Security Administration had been studying his case as part of a broader review of training protocols and decision-making processes. Your experience has led to significant improvements in how we prepare guards for complex international situations, she wrote. While the outcome was unfortunate for you personally, the lessons learned have made the entire Royal Guard more effective at balancing vigilance with judgment. The letter went on to mention that the palace administration had donated funding to support Marcus's community center program, recognizing it as an innovative approach to developing the kind of character and judgment that effective security work required. Perhaps, Morrison concluded, your greatest service to the protection of others began not with your success as a guard, but with your willingness to learn from your failure and use that learning to help others. On a warm evening in late spring, Marcus stood in Master Takashi's garden, watching a group of teenagers from the community center practice the kata they had been learning. Their movements were still rough, lacking the precision that came with years of training, but he could see in their faces the same sense of purpose and belonging that he had felt when he first walked into the dojo nearly 20 years earlier. You have found your way back, Master Takashi observed, joining him under the maple tree whose leaves were now bright green with new growth. I'm not sure I ever really left, Marcus replied. I think I just needed to understand that the path was bigger than I thought it was. The old sensei smiled. The warrior's greatest victory is not over others, but over his own understanding of what strength means. You believed that strength was about never making mistakes. Now you understand that true strength is about learning from mistakes and using that learning to serve others. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the garden where Marcus had first begun to understand the deeper meaning of his experience, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The black belt around his waist still represented 18 years of dedicated training, but now it also symbolized something more. The understanding that mastery was not a destination, but a continuous process of growth, learning, and service. His failure at the palace had ended one chapter of his life, but it had also opened the door to a deeper understanding of what it meant to be a protector. He was no longer a royal guard, but he was still in the truest sense a guardian, someone who used his strength, his knowledge, and his hard-won wisdom to help others find their own path to safety, confidence, and purpose. The teenagers continued their practice as darkness fell, their movements becoming more confident with each repetition. In their determination and growing skill, Marcus could see the reflection of his own journey. Not the perfect execution of techniques learned long ago, but the ongoing process of becoming someone worthy of the trust others placed in him. It had taken the most humbling failure of his life to teach him the most important lesson of all, that true mastery was not about never falling down, but about how you chose to get back up.